Hello, and welcome to the Earth's Library. Find a comfortable place to settle and let your mind grow quiet. Tonight, we are opening one of the greatest books ever written, the Earth itself. Its pages are the layers of ancient rock, and within them is a 4.5 billion-year-old story of fire and ice, of continents drifting in a slow and patient dance, and of the long, beautiful, and often violent unfolding of life. But tonight, we are not reading a chapter that is there. We are exploring a chapter that is missing. Imagine a great and ancient book, and right in its most crucial section, 1,000 pages have been torn out, leaving no trace. This is the story of the Great Unconformity, a prehistoric time hole, a silent and profound gap in our planet's memory that science is still struggling to explain. We are talking about more than 1 billion years of Earth's history that have simply vanished from the rock record. A hole in time so vast it makes the entire age of the dinosaurs look like a brief footnote. It is a period longer than it took for the first simple cells to evolve into every plant and animal you have ever seen. 1 billion years, just gone, as if wiped away by a cosmic eraser. Before we journey into this deep and profound mystery, let us take a moment to arrive where we are, where the night is deep and the first hints of a new day are not far off. On your side of the world, a quiet peace holds sway. In this moment, we are connected, you and I, sharing this quiet exploration into a great and ancient puzzle. If this kind of slow, deep journey into the mysteries of our world is a place your mind feels at home, consider subscribing to the Earth's Library and leaving a like on this documentary. It helps these quiet questions find others who are listening in the night. Our story does not begin in a laboratory, but in the heart of a wild and unexplored canyon, with a one-armed geology professor on a mission that everyone told him was impossible. It was there, in the vast, silent rock walls of the Grand Canyon, that he first saw the scar, a clean, sharp line in the stone that would become one of the greatest and most enduring mysteries in the history of our planet. And so, our journey begins. Our story begins not with a satellite image or a laboratory analysis, but with a man, a river, and a canyon that held one of the planet's greatest secrets in its silent stone walls. The year was 1869, and John Wesley Powell, a one-armed Civil War veteran and geology professor, was leading a small, desperate expedition down the uncharted waters of the Colorado River. This was a blank space on the map, a dangerous and unknown world of rapids and rock, and Powell's mission was to map it, to read the story written in its ancient stones. As he and his crew floated deeper into the immense vertical landscape of what would become known as the Grand Canyon, Powell, a man who knew how to read the language of rock, saw a story unfolding. He saw the layers stacked one on top of the other, like the pages of a great book. Older rocks at the bottom, younger rocks at the top, each layer a chapter telling the story of an ancient sea, a long-vanished desert, or a slow and patient accumulation of mud over millions of years. But then he saw something that did not make sense. A scar, a clean, sharp, horizontal line in the canyon wall where two completely different kinds of rock met with an impossible abruptness. Below the line were the oldest rocks, the dark, twisted, crystalline foundations of the continent, a testament to immense heat and pressure from a time when the Earth was still being forged. Above the line were neat, flat layers of sandstone, much younger, looking almost modern by comparison. Powell knew he was looking at an unconformity, a gap in the geological record where time had been erased by erosion. But the sheer scale of this gap was unimaginable. The rocks below were over 1.5 billion years old, while the rocks directly on top of them were a mere 500 million. Powell was staring at a clean break in the story, a place where more than 1 billion years of Earth's history were simply gone, an entire volume ripped from the planet's autobiography. He called it the Great Unconformity, and as geologists began to explore other parts of the world, they found the same scar, the same impossible gap in time in the rocks of every continent. An entire chapter of our world's history, the very chapter in which complex life first began its great journey, had been systematically torn away, leaving behind a profound and beautiful mystery that we are only now, 1.5 centuries later, beginning to solve. To explain 1 billion years of missing time requires a theory of almost unimaginable power. For decades after Powell's discovery, the leading suspect was a world of ice. Geologists found strange and puzzling evidence from this same lost era, a time around 700 million years ago, suggesting that the Earth had plunged into the most severe ice age in its history. This was not like the ice ages of our more recent past, with glaciers covering only the northern continents. This was a deeper, more profound, and more terrifying freeze. They called it Snowball Earth. The evidence suggested that the entire planet, from the poles to the equator, had been covered in a sheet of ice, perhaps 1 kilometer thick. The oceans were frozen solid, and the continents were buried under glaciers that made the Antarctic ice sheet look small by comparison. It was a planetary deep freeze, a white, silent world hanging in space that may have lasted for millions of years. This catastrophic glaciation seemed like the perfect culprit for the Great Unconformity. Imagine glaciers, miles high, not just in the polar regions, but everywhere. As they grew and moved, their immense weight would have acted like a colossal piece of sandpaper, grinding and scraping away the rock beneath them. Over millions of years of this relentless, global-scale erosion, it was plausible that an entire eon's worth of rock could have been pulverized to dust and washed away. The theory was elegant, dramatic, and it fit the timeline perfectly. The Snowball Earth events happened right in the middle of the missing billion years. It seemed, for a time, that the mystery of the Great Time Hole had been solved, but the Earth is a complex and subtle storyteller, and the truth, as it so often is, was even stranger and more wonderful than a simple world of ice. New evidence began to emerge, not from the cold of the ice, but from the deep, fiery heat of the planet's interior. It came from our understanding of plate tectonics and the slow, inexorable dance of the continents. Scientists realized that during this same lost era, the world's landmasses were not scattered as they are today. They were fused together into a single immense supercontinent called Rodinia. This forgotten world, which existed long before Pangaea, was now seen as the key. Supercontinents, it turns out, are not stable. They are torn apart by the immense heat that builds up beneath them. As Rodinia began to rip itself apart, it would have created a period of geological violence unlike anything in our more recent history, thrusting up mountain ranges that may have been the largest the world has ever seen. And it was this colossal, planetary-scale mountain building, and the erosion that followed, that offered a new and more complete explanation for our billion-year gap in time. The theory of a world covered in ice, a great and dramatic suspect for the crime of the missing billion years, began to melt away under the heat of new evidence. The true culprit was not a global winter, but a global shattering. The stage for this event was Rodinia, a vast and ancient supercontinent that held nearly all the world's land in a single colossal embrace. For millions of years, it had been stable, but deep beneath its foundations, the slow, fiery breath of the Earth's mantle was creating a tension that the ancient rock could not withstand. Rodinia was beginning to tear itself apart. This was not a gentle process. The breakup of a supercontinent is one of the most violent acts in our planet's geologic repertoire. Imagine a landmass larger than any continent today, slowly being stretched and thinned from below. The crust would have fractured, creating immense rift valleys thousands of kilometers long. Volcanoes would have awoken along these new wounds, pouring out rivers of lava and vast clouds of gas. And as the pieces of the continent began to pull away from each other, the crust buckled and warped, thrusting up mountain ranges that may have been the largest and most extensive in Earth's history. It was these new, colossal mountains that became the key to the mystery. Mountains, once raised, are immediately subject to the relentless forces of erosion, but the erosion that took place on Rodinia was on a scale that is difficult to comprehend today, for one simple reason: there were no plants. The land was a world of naked rock and dust. There were no roots to hold the soil, no forests to soften the fall of the rain. Every gust of wind and every drop of water could carry away the land with an efficiency that is impossible on our modern green Earth. For hundreds of millions of years, as Rodinia slowly fractured, these immense barren mountain ranges were worn down, grain by grain. Entire vertical kilometers of rock were stripped away, ground into sand and dust, and washed by great rivers into the single vast ocean that surrounded the dying supercontinent. This was not a localized event. It was a planetary-scale resurfacing. As different parts of Rodinia uplifted and tore apart at different times, this immense erosional event happened in waves across the globe. The result was a scar, a deep and profound wound in the geologic record, where 1 billion years of history were simply ground down and washed away forever, leaving behind the clean, sharp line that Powell had first seen in the silent walls of the Grand Canyon. The tearing apart of a supercontinent and the grinding down of its colossal mountains was not just a geological event, it was a planetary transformation that would have profound and unexpected consequences for the future of life. The story of the Great Unconformity is not just about missing rock. It is about what that missing rock did. As entire mountain ranges were worn away into sand and dust, great rivers, swollen by an altered climate, carried this immense load of sediment into the single, vast ocean of Panthalassa. This was not a gentle process. It was a deluge of nutrients on a scale the world had never seen. For billions of years, the Earth's oceans had been relatively poor in the essential minerals that life needs to build complex bodies. But now, the erosion of a continent was acting like a colossal fertilizer factory, pumping phosphorus, nitrogen, iron, and other vital elements into the seas. At the same time, the breakup of Rodinia created new coastlines and vast shallow continental shelves, places where sunlight could reach the seafloor for the first time in eons. The stage was now set for a biological revolution. Fueled by this sudden and massive influx of nutrients and the creation of new sunlit habitats, the simple, single-celled life that had dominated the planet for 3 billion years began to experiment. In the shallow, nutrient-rich waters of this new world, the first complex, multicellular organisms appeared. These were the Ediacaran fauna, strange, soft-bodied creatures that looked like nothing that has ever lived since. Frond-like forms, quilted mattresses, and bizarre disc-shaped organisms. They were life's first tentative step into complexity. But this was only the beginning. The massive erosion event also fundamentally changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. The weathering of vast amounts of fresh rock pulled enormous quantities of carbon dioxide from the air, while the nutrient-fueled explosion of photosynthetic algae in the oceans began to pump unprecedented amounts of oxygen into the sky. The Earth was not just being resurfaced, it was being re-engineered, setting the stage for the most spectacular explosion of life in its history. The billion years of missing time were not just an erasure, they were a preparation, a long and violent process that would finally provide the ingredients for the dawn of the animal kingdom. The grinding down of a supercontinent was not just an act of destruction, it was a profound act of creation. The billion years of missing time were not just an empty space in the planet's memory. They were a necessary preparation, a long and violent process that fundamentally re-engineered the chemistry of the world and set the stage for the most spectacular explosion of life in Earth's history. The key was the sheer unimaginable volume of rock and mineral that was stripped from the dying continent of Rodinia and washed into the single vast ocean of Panthalassa. For billions of years, the Earth's seas had been relatively poor in the essential building blocks of complex life, but now the erosion of a continent was acting like a colossal fertilizer factory, pumping phosphorus, nitrogen, iron, and other vital elements into the water on a scale never seen before or since. This deluge of nutrients, combined with the creation of vast new sunlit shallow seas along the edges of the fracturing continents, created a perfect cradle for a biological revolution. In these newly enriched waters, the simple, single-celled life that had dominated the planet for 3 billion years began to experiment. The first tentative steps into a new kind of being appeared in the fossil record. These were the Ediacaran fauna, strange, soft-bodied creatures that looked like nothing that has ever lived since. Quilted, mattress-like forms that lay on the seafloor. Bizarre, frond-like organisms that waved gently in the ancient currents, and mysterious, disc-shaped creatures whose place in the story of life is still a puzzle. They were life's first strange and ultimately failed experiment in building large multicellular bodies. But they were only the beginning. The massive erosion event also fundamentally changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. The weathering of vast amounts of fresh rock pulled enormous quantities of carbon dioxide from the air, while the nutrient-fueled explosion of photosynthetic algae in the oceans began to pump unprecedented amounts of oxygen into the sky. The Earth was not just being resurfaced, it was being re-engineered. And this new oxygen-rich world was exactly what was needed for the next great leap. The stage was set, the ingredients were in place, and in a geological blink of an eye, life responded with an explosion of creativity so profound that it still stands as one of science's most beautiful and enduring mysteries: the Cambrian explosion, the true dawn of the animal kingdom. The stage, as it was set, was unlike any that had come before in the 3 billion-year history of life. The world, newly sculpted by the memory of a lost continent and newly oxygenated by the labors of microscopic algae, held its breath. The strange gardens of the Ediacaran period, with their quilted, soft-bodied forms, had been a dress rehearsal, a quiet, gentle experiment. But the ingredients for a far more dramatic performance were now in place. The influx of minerals had provided the essential building blocks for skeletons and shells, and the abundance of oxygen provided the high-energy fuel needed for movement, for hunting, and for thinking. The world was primed for an explosion, and in the geological blink of an eye, the fuse was lit. What followed was not a slow, gradual branching of the tree of life, but a frantic, dazzling burst of creation known as the Cambrian explosion. For the first time, the oceans were filled with sound and fury. Life had invented the predator. Swimming through the Cambrian seas was Anomalocaris, the uncontested apex predator of its time, a creature nearly a meter long that seemed assembled from a dream. It possessed two fearsome spined appendages for grasping prey, and a square, circular mouth lined with teeth for crushing the newly evolved shells of its victims. Its existence alone created a powerful new force in the world: fear. This singular pressure sparked an evolutionary arms race. In response to predators, life began to build armor. The trilobites emerged, scuttling across the seafloor in their resilient, segmented exoskeletons. They were a global success story, diversifying into thousands of species. They looked out at their world through newly invented compound eyes, some of the very first and most complex visual organs to ever appear on Earth. The seafloor itself became a landscape of the bizarre. Strange creatures like Wiwaxia crawled along, its body covered in carbonaceous scales and long defensive spines, a living pincushion. From the mud sprouted what appeared to be alien flowers, but were in fact the filter-feeding mouths of worms whose bodies remained hidden beneath the surface. Perhaps the most perplexing of all was Hallucigenia, a tiny, stilt-walking enigma with defensive spines on its back and delicate, claw-tipped legs. A creature so strange that for decades paleontologists couldn't even be sure which side was up. The Cambrian explosion was not just the addition of a few new species. It was the sudden invention of nearly every basic body plan, or phylum, that exists today. It was the birth of bilateral symmetry, of guts and gills, of heads and tails, of nervous systems and beating hearts. This was the moment that the blueprint for the entire animal kingdom was drafted, a frantic and beautiful period of innovation that would never be equaled. The long, slow preparation of the missing billion years had finally and spectacularly paid off. The Cambrian explosion was not merely an act of addition, but of interaction. The seas were no longer a simple soup of disconnected organisms. They had become a complex web of relationships, a system of finders and keepers, of hunters and the hunted. The quiet world of the Precambrian was gone forever. Two revolutionary innovations, born from this newly energized environment, accelerated this feedback loop of creation beyond anything the planet had ever witnessed: the power of sight and the art of the hunt. Before the Cambrian, life largely perceived the world through touch and chemical trails. It was a blurry, indistinct existence. But the evolution of the eye changed everything. For the first time, an organism could see its food from a distance, or spot a predator before it struck. The world snapped into focus. Trilobites developed incredibly sophisticated compound eyes, lenses crafted from pure calcite crystals, oriented with atomic precision to prevent double vision. They could see their world with a clarity that was previously unimaginable, allowing them to navigate, find mates, and avoid the lurking shadow of an Anomalocaris. This new sense created a world of light and shadow, of pursuit and escape. Vision turned the oceans into a transparent arena, and in doing so, it ignited a furious arms race. With sight came the perfection of predation, and with predation came the urgent need for defense. The very minerals that the great unconformity had washed into the seas, the calcium, the phosphates, were now the bricks and mortar for this new era of biological warfare. Life used these raw materials to build shells, plates, and spines. This new dynamic, this intricate dance of survival, is what truly fueled the explosion of diversity. It wasn't enough to simply exist anymore. One had to exist in relation to others. Organisms that developed harder shells were more likely to survive an attack, passing on the genes for better armor. In response, predators developed stronger claws or more effective ways to pierce that armor. Some creatures abandoned the exposed seafloor, developing the ability to burrow into the sediment, creating new ecosystems beneath the surface. Others evolved early forms of jet propulsion to make a quick escape. Every new adaptation by one organism demanded an evolutionary answer from another. The result was a cascade of creativity, a biological chain reaction that rapidly filled every available ecological niche with new and wondrous forms. This was the true legacy of the Cambrian explosion, the establishment of the ecological rules that still govern our world today. The genetic toolkit for building the fundamental components of animal life, eyes, limbs, shells, and nervous systems, was assembled in this brief, fiery crucible of time, a blueprint from which all future complexity would be drawn. The world was now alive and awake, and our own story, deep in the branches of this newly formed tree of life, was about to begin. Out of the brilliant chaos of the Cambrian explosion, a new and lasting order began to take shape. The oceans were now bustling ecosystems with established hierarchies of predators and prey. The seafloor belonged to the armored trilobites and other hard-shelled arthropods who foraged in the rich sediment, secure in their external skeletons. The waters above were patrolled by formidable hunters, their newly evolved eyes scanning for any unprotected meal. In this dangerous and competitive new world, a different kind of creature began its journey, one that was small, soft-bodied, and seemingly insignificant. It possessed no shell, no spines, no terrifying claws. Its survival depended on an entirely new evolutionary strategy, a radical design that would ultimately give rise to the entire vertebrate kingdom, including ourselves. This was the birth of the chordates. Among the strange fossils of the Cambrian are the impressions of small, leaf-shaped swimmers like Pacaya. At a glance, they were unremarkable, easily overshadowed by their armored contemporaries. But they carried within their bodies a revolutionary piece of biological architecture, a notochord. This was a flexible, supportive rod that ran the length of their body, providing an internal scaffold. Unlike the heavy, confining exoskeletons of the arthropods, this internal structure was lightweight and supple. It allowed for a new and efficient kind of movement, a side-to-side muscular ripple that could propel the creature through the water with speed and grace. This was the blueprint for the backbone, the very first draft of the vertebrate spine. This internal design was a gamble in a world of external armor, but it carried profound advantages. An internal skeleton can grow along with an organism, eliminating the vulnerable process of molting that left arthropods soft and defenseless. More importantly, this central rod provided the framework for a more sophisticated nervous system to develop, protected alongside it. For now, though, these early ancestors of ours were the underdogs of the Cambrian seas. They were likely filter feeders, hiding and darting between larger, more powerful animals, making a quiet living in the margins. Their success was not in dominance, but in evasion and adaptability. While the trilobites ruled the present, the humble chordates held the patent for the future. Their simple notochord was a seed of potential, the starting point for an evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to bone, jaws, fins, legs, and ultimately consciousness. In the great theater of life, made possible by the planetary reset of the Great Unconformity, a new and pivotal character had just swam quietly onto the stage. The world that our soft-bodied ancestors inherited was one of escalating danger. The evolutionary blueprint of the notochord provided a wonderful advantage in movement, but it offered little protection against a closing claw or a crushing mouth. For this lineage to survive the long game of evolution, it needed to solve the problem of defense. The arthropods had found their answer in external armor made of chitin, but our ancestors stumbled upon a different, more permanent solution. They began to reinforce their bodies with a revolutionary new material, a living tissue that could serve as both shield and scaffold. They invented bone. This innovation did not appear overnight as a complete internal skeleton. Instead, bone's first role was for external protection. In the geological periods that followed the Cambrian, a new kind of creature emerged, the ostracoderms, or the shell-skinned fish. These were the first true vertebrates. They were typically small, jawless bottom dwellers that swam awkwardly, filtering nutrients from the mud and sand, but covering their heads and front sections were intricate, heavy plates of dermal bone. They were like small swimming tanks, combining the chordate's flexible tail for propulsion with a solid bony helmet for defense against the dominant predators of the time, the sea scorpions. But bone was far more than just armor. It was a biological battery. This new tissue served as a vital internal storage unit for essential minerals like calcium and phosphate. These elements are crucial for regulating metabolism and nerve function. By developing a way to store and release these minerals from bone, our ancestors gained a powerful new level of control over their internal chemistry. This physiological advantage allowed them to thrive and diversify, even pushing into new environments like rivers and estuaries, where the mineral content of the water was unstable. The very elements that the Great Unconformity had scoured from the continents and washed into the sea were now being incorporated directly into the bodies of living things, creating a durable internal framework. The foundation was now laid. With a protected head and a flexible spine, our lineage was no longer just a passive survivor, but to truly step out of the shadows, it would need to evolve one more key innovation, one that would turn it from a timid filter feeder into a hunter and change the face of the oceans forever. The invention of bone had given our ancestors a foothold in a dangerous world, but it was a world in which they were still fundamentally prey. The oceans of the Silurian and Devonian periods, 400 million years ago, were ruled by monsters. Giant sea scorpions, arthropods called eurypterids, still haunted the shallows, some growing larger than a human. In this landscape, the small, jawless, and heavily armored ostracoderms could do little more than hide and hope their bony shields were strong enough. They were passive participants in the game of life, sucking detritus from the seafloor, while the real drama of the hunt happened above them. For the vertebrate lineage to move from the margins to the mainstream, it needed to stop reacting to the world and start acting upon it. It needed a mouth that could do more than just filter. It needed to learn how to bite. The evolution of the jaw is perhaps the single most important and revolutionary event in our entire ancestry, for it was the jaw that finally turned our forebears into formidable predators and set them on the path to true dominance. The jaw was not created from nothing. Evolution is not an inventor, but a magnificent tinkerer, repurposing existing structures for new and wonderful functions. In the jawless fish, the gills used for breathing were supported by a series of flexible cartilaginous arches. These gill arches help to hold the delicate gill filaments open. The first two of these arches, situated at the very front of the throat, underwent a profound transformation. Through a series of gradual modifications, they migrated forward, enlarged, and became hinged. Their initial new purpose was likely to improve respiration, creating a pump that could pull water more efficiently over the gills. This would have also made them better suction feeders. But once this hinged structure was in place, evolution began to experiment with its offensive potential. The skin around this new mobile mouth was covered in tiny, sharp scales called dermal denticles. Over time, these sharp scales became larger, more specialized, and anchored to the hinged arches, becoming the first true teeth. The gill support had become a weapon. With this innovation, the floodgates of vertebrate potential were thrown open. A new class of creature, the placoderms, or plate-skinned fish, rose to power. They combined the heavy bone armor of their ancestors with the terrifying new advantage of a powerful bite. They were the first vertebrate superpredators, and they diversified into a stunning array of forms. The undisputed king of this new dynasty was Dunkleosteus. This was not a fish to be trifled with. Growing up to 6 meters in length, the size of a modern great white shark, its head and torso were encased in a fortress of thick, bony plates. It had no teeth in the modern sense. Instead, its jaws were equipped with massive, self-sharpening bony blades that could slice through the armor of other placoderms with the force of a guillotine. The reign of Dunkleosteus and its kin represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power on Earth. For the first time, vertebrates were at the top of the food chain. The giant sea scorpions that had terrorized their ancestors were now their prey. The jaw allowed for a new kind of existence, an active, predatory lifestyle, fueled by the high oxygen-rich environment that was the enduring legacy of the great unconformity. The ability to bite, to grasp, to shear, and to crush opened up countless new ecological niches, leading to a massive radiation of fish species. Yet, for all their power and success, the placoderms' heavy armor locked them into a specific way of life. Their dominance was to be absolute, but ultimately brief. Swimming in their shadows, 2 other groups of jawed fish were perfecting a lighter, more adaptable design. These were the cartilaginous fish, the ancestors of sharks, and a revolutionary new group called the bony fish. They were the future, and their time was coming.
The Devonian period was the age of fishes, but it was also an age of titans. The reign of the placoderms, with their immense bony armor and shearing jaws, was a declaration that the vertebrate lineage had finally achieved dominance. But this dominance, built on the principle of impenetrable defense, was as heavy and inflexible as the armor plates that defined it. As the Devonian period drew to a close, the world was shaken by one of the greatest extinction events in its history. The exact causes are still debated, but the result was clear. The heavily specialized placoderms, the titans of bone, vanished forever. Their evolutionary experiment, though spectacular, had come to an end. Out of the void left by their extinction, the two more adaptable groups that had been swimming in their shadows rose to prominence, diversifying to fill the newly emptied oceans. These were two separate and brilliant solutions to the question of vertebrate survival, and their descendants would go on to rule the aquatic realm to this day. The first path was one of ruthless efficiency and streamlined perfection. This was the path of the cartilaginous fish, the ancestors of modern sharks, rays, and skates. They abandoned the placoderm's heavy investment in bone, opting instead for a skeleton made of lightweight, flexible, and incredibly strong cartilage. This gave them a tremendous advantage in speed and agility. They became the perfect hunters, their bodies shaped by 400 million years of relentless focus on finding and catching prey. Instead of fixed bony blades, their jaws were armed with a conveyor belt of replaceable true teeth, ensuring a lifetime of sharpness. They solved the problem of buoyancy not with an internal float, but with a large, oily liver that helped them stay afloat, and with fins shaped like aeroplane wings that generated lift as they moved. To this day, the shark is an icon of evolutionary endurance, a design so successful that it has needed little modification since it first appeared in the ancient seas. The second path was one of precision, control, and unimaginable diversity. This was the path of the osteichthyes, the bony fish, the lineage that would eventually give rise to 99% of all fish species on Earth. While they retained bone, they refined it, trading heavy external armor for a strong but lightweight internal skeleton. Their greatest innovation, however, was the swim bladder. This internal gas-filled sac, which had evolved from a primitive lung, allowed them to achieve neutral buoyancy. A bony fish can hang motionless in the water column, expending almost no energy. It can ascend or descend with just a thought. This remarkable adaptation freed them from the constant need for movement that defines a shark's existence. It opened up a world of new possibilities, hiding in wait for prey, navigating complex reefs with pinpoint accuracy, or hovering delicately to pick food from crevices. Their fins, supported by fine, bony rays, became instruments of precision, allowing them to brake, turn on a dime, and even swim in reverse. These two great lineages, the sharks and the bony fish, effectively divided the planet's waters between them. One represented the pinnacle of fast, open ocean predation, the other the mastery of intricate, controlled movement and adaptation to every conceivable aquatic niche. But within the bony fish, a fateful division had occurred. The vast majority became the ray-finned fish, who perfected this life in the water. But there was another, much rarer group, the Sarcopterygii, or the lobe-finned fish. Their fins were different. Instead of a fan of delicate rays, their fins were fleshy, muscular stalks, supported by the same core pattern of bones that now exist in our arms and legs. These strange fish, like the ancient Eustinopteron, often lived in shallow, swampy, oxygen-poor waters, where their primitive lungs, the same organ that became the swim bladder in their cousins, were a vital asset for breathing air. As the Devonian world faced unpredictable climates and seasonal droughts, these creatures found themselves uniquely equipped, with lungs that could breathe air and fins that were beginning to look an awful lot like legs. A new world, a world without water, awaited.
The world of the late Devonian period was a planet of two wildly different realities. Below the surface of the water, life was a vibrant, chaotic, and crowded success story. The oceans, rivers, and lakes teemed with the descendants of the Cambrian explosion. Sharks patrolled the reefs, and untold legions of bony fish navigated a world of complex, established ecosystems. But above the water, a profound silence reigned. This was the other reality. The land. For billions of years, the continents had been largely barren, hostile frontiers of naked rock. By the Devonian, this was changing. The first true forests had taken root. Strange collections of giant, tree-like ferns and club mosses that created a humid, alien landscape. Invertebrates, insects, scorpions, and millipedes had long since made this world their own. Yet the land was still missing something. There were no calls, no rustles in the undergrowth from larger animals, no footprints in the damp earth, save for those of bugs. The continents, green and waiting, were an empty stage, a vast and unclaimed opportunity. For the lobe-finned fish and their shallow, freshwater swamps, the land was not a distant dream, but an ever-present reality, and sometimes a threat. These were not the stable, open oceans their ray-finned cousins enjoyed. This was a world of fluctuating water levels, of seasonal droughts that could shrink a thriving river into a series of stagnant, muddy pools. In this environment, their unique toolkit became a key to survival. Their primitive lungs allowed them to gulp air from the surface when the water became thick and deoxygenated, and their strange, muscular, bone-supported fins gave them a way to navigate the shallows that other fish could not match. They could prop themselves up on the bottom, a crucial advantage for an ambush predator. This combination of traits, forged in the crucible of these challenging environments, pre-adapted them for the greatest journey in the history of life. The evidence for this monumental step is captured perfectly in a creature named Tiktaalik. Discovered in the Canadian Arctic, Tiktaalik is the quintessential transitional form, a fishapod that beautifully bridges the gap between aquatic and terrestrial life. It had the scales, gills, and fin rays of its fish ancestors, but it also possessed a flattened, crocodile-like skull, with eyes positioned on top, perfect for peeking above the water surface. It had a flexible neck, allowing it to turn its head independently of its body, a critical skill for scanning a shoreline, and an ability no fish had. Most importantly, within its fleshy, lobe-like fins was the unmistakable pattern of a limb, a large upper arm bone, 2 forearm bones, and a cluster of smaller bones corresponding to a wrist. Tiktaalik could do a push-up. It was not a land dweller, but an inhabitant of the boundary, a creature of the verge, perfectly adapted to hunting in the shallows and, when necessary, hauling itself onto a mudflat to escape a predator or to the next pool. Following Tiktaalik, creatures like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega show the final pieces falling into place. The fin rays disappeared, replaced by the first true digits, fingers and toes, 8 to a limb. The hips and shoulders became more robust, preparing to take on the full, crushing burden of gravity. Life was crawling out of the water. This was the ultimate delayed consequence of the great unconformity. The oxygen-rich air these creatures were now breathing was a gift from the planetary reset hundreds of millions of years earlier. The vertebrate body plan, forged in the Cambrian seas, was now being radically repurposed to conquer a new dimension. These first amphibians, the first tetrapods, had arrived. They stood blinking in the alien sun, masters of a new world, but they were not yet truly free. The memory of the water still flowed in their veins, and to it they would have to return to lay their vulnerable fish-like eggs, still tied by an invisible umbilical cord to the world they had left behind. The first tetrapods had achieved the seemingly impossible. They had walked out of the water and taken their first breaths in a new world. But they had not arrived in an empty land. The world they entered, the Great Carboniferous Period, was a humid, alien greenhouse of colossal scale. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with so much oxygen, nearly 35% compared to our 21% today, that it supercharged life. This was a world of giants. Dragonflies called meganeura, with the wingspans of eagles, hunted through the forests. Millipedes named arthropopleura, as long as a car, crawled through the damp undergrowth. The forests themselves were not made of the trees we know, but of towering 50-meter-tall lycopods and tree ferns. Their fallen ancestors slowly being compressed into the vast coal seams that give the period its name. Amid this lush and intimidating landscape, our amphibian ancestors were pioneers. But they were pioneers on a leash. They were still bound to the water, a world they had to return to for every generation, to lay their soft, gelatinous eggs, which would perish in the dry air. This tether confined them to the swamplands and coastlines, leaving the vast, dry interiors of the forming supercontinent of Pangaea as a forbidden kingdom. To truly conquer the land, the vertebrates needed to solve this final problem of their aquatic past. They needed to invent a way to bring the water with them. The solution, when it came, was one of the most elegant and profound innovations in the history of life: the amniotic egg. This was more than just an egg with a shell. It was a self-contained, private pond, a life support system that allowed an embryo to develop entirely on dry land. The tough, leathery or hard shell was the first layer of defense, porous enough to allow oxygen in and carbon dioxide out, but robust enough to prevent deadly water loss. Inside, a series of remarkable membranes created a perfect aquatic environment. A fluid-filled sac, the amnion, cradled the developing embryo in a buoyant, watery cushion. A yolk sac provided a rich, energy-dense food supply, and a final sac, the allantois, collected waste products. For the first time, a vertebrate could be born on a high mountain or in a dry desert, hundreds of miles from the nearest swamp. The umbilical cord to the water had been decisively cut. The small, lizard-like creatures that evolved this revolutionary technology were the first amniotes, and they immediately held the key to the continents. An early example, Hylonomus, was a tiny animal, just 20 centimeters long, that hunted insects and other invertebrates in the Carboniferous forests. With the freedom to roam, the amniotes quickly diverged, splitting into two great dynasties that would compete for control of the planet for the next 300 million years. The first group was the Saurosides, the lineage that would eventually produce all lizards, snakes, crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds. The second group was the Synapsids. They looked like reptiles, but a key difference in their skull, a single opening behind the eye socket for jaw muscle attachment, marked them as something entirely different. These were our ancestors. This was the lineage that would, in the far distant future, give rise to mammals. One of the most famous early synapsids was the magnificent Dimetrodon, a formidable predator with a huge sail-like fin on its back. Though it walked and looked like a great lizard, it was not a reptile, nor was it a dinosaur. It was one of our own kin, an early and powerful experiment on the road to becoming mammalian. The stage was now set. With the amniotic egg, the conquest of Pangaea could begin, sparking a long and dramatic rivalry between these two great families, the ancestors of the dinosaurs and our own.
The amniotic egg had unlocked the continents, and the two great dynasties, the Saurids and the Synapsids, began a long and epic struggle for dominance. The world they sought to conquer was itself transforming. The slow, inexorable forces of plate tectonics were pushing the world's land masses together, forging the colossal supercontinent of Pangaea. The creation of this single immense continent dramatically altered the global climate. The wet, swampy world of the Carboniferous began to dry out, replaced by a harsher, more seasonal climate with vast arid deserts in its interior. In this challenging new environment, it was our own lineage, the Synapsids, that rose to become the undisputed rulers of the world. The Permian period was not an age of dinosaurs. It was the age of our own distant cousins. The key to the Synapsid's success was a suite of powerful new adaptations for dealing with this tougher world. The famous sail of Dimetrodon, for instance, was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. It was not for defense or display, but a highly sophisticated radiator. By turning its sail toward the morning sun, it could rapidly warm its blood, becoming active and ready to hunt long before its cold-blooded Saurisid competitors could shake off the morning chill. In the intense midday heat, it could pump blood through the sail and radiate the excess warmth into the air, preventing overheating. This metabolic advantage was a significant step on the long road to true warm-bloodedness. Furthermore, their jaws showcased another hallmark of our lineage, specialized teeth. While most Saurisids had simple, peg-like teeth, Synapsids had developed incisors for nipping, long canines for stabbing, and shearing cheek teeth for processing food more efficiently. This allowed them to exploit a wider variety of food sources and established the basic dental pattern that we mammals still possess today. As the Permian wore on, even more advanced synapsids, the therapsids, came to dominate. These were the so-called mammal-like reptiles, though they were not reptiles at all, but the direct ancestors of mammals. Their bodies showed remarkable changes. Their legs began to move from the sprawling gait of a lizard to a more upright posture directly beneath the body, allowing for more efficient and sustained movement. This group produced the first saber-toothed apex predators, the terrifying Gorgonopsians, wolf-like hunters with immense canine fangs. They also produced vast herds of successful herbivores, like the Dicynodonts, stout, pig-like animals with turtle-like beaks and a pair of tusks. For tens of millions of years, the world belonged to them. The top predators were our relatives. The most abundant large herbivores were our relatives. The Saurisids, the ancestors of the dinosaurs, were, for the most part, small, marginal creatures living in the shadows of this great Synapsid dynasty. They had built the world's first truly modern terrestrial ecosystems, complex webs of life stretching across the vast plains and forests of Pangaea. Fossil evidence, like nerve pits on the snout bones of some species, suggests they may have even evolved whiskers and perhaps the first hints of fur. They were, in every sense, the masters of their time. But the geological forces that had built their world were indifferent to their success. As the Permian period reached its zenith, a deep and violent tremor began to shake the planet from within. In the lands that would one day become Siberia, the ground began to split open,
heralding the beginning of a volcanic event so colossal it would dwarf any eruption in human history. The golden age of the synapsids and nearly all life on Earth was about to be brought to a horrific and suffocating end. The world at the close of the Permian period was a triumph of life's tenacity, a global ecosystem painstakingly built over 200 million years since the Cambrian explosion. At its apex were our own relatives, the synapsids, from the formidable saber-toothed gorgonoptions to the vast herds of tusked dicynodonts. They had mastered the harsh climate of Pangaea and established a complex and stable dynasty. They were the undisputed rulers of a world that seemed destined to be theirs. But the planet upon which they walked was a living, breathing entity with a fiery, violent heart. And deep beneath the continent, in the land we now call Siberia, that heart was preparing to unleash a cataclysm so profound it would make all previous extinctions pale in comparison. The world was about to be burned, suffocated, and poisoned to the very brink of annihilation. This was the Great Dying. It did not begin with the impact of an asteroid, but with a slow, tearing wound in the Earth's own crust. Vast fissures, hundreds of kilometers long, split the ground open, and from them erupted not a single explosion, but a relentless, horrifying flood of basaltic lava. This was the Siberian Traps, a flood basalt event on a scale that is nearly impossible to comprehend. For the better part of 1 million years, lava poured forth, wave after wave, burying a landmass larger than Western Europe under a blanket of molten rock kilometers deep. The immediate effect was a regional incineration, but the true devastation was global and atmospheric. The eruptions blasted colossal clouds of sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere, which circled the globe, blocking out the sun and plunging the world into a brief but deadly volcanic winter. This sulfur then fell back to the surface as corrosive acid rain, defoliating the great Permian forests and poisoning the soils and rivers. This initial shock, however, was merely the prelude. The main killer was the carbon dioxide, pumped into the atmosphere in unimaginable quantities, thousands of gigatons at a time. As the volcanic winter subsided, a runaway greenhouse effect took hold. Global temperatures soared, rising by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. The polar ice caps, which had existed for millions of years, vanished completely, and the planet settled into a long, suffocating fever dream. The oceans, heated by the scorching atmosphere, began to die. Warm water holds less oxygen, and as temperatures rose, vast anoxic zones spread from the depths, choking marine life. The normal ocean currents may have stagnated and shut down, turning the seas into a stratified, layered trap of poisonous water. In this oxygen-starved environment, anaerobic bacteria that produce toxic hydrogen sulfide gas thrived. In a final apocalyptic phase, it is thought that this toxic gas, smelling of rotten eggs, may have bubbled out of the dying oceans and into the air, poisoning the remaining life on land. The fossil record falls eerily silent. It shows a world where roughly 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species were extinguished. The complex ecosystems of the Permian collapsed into a ghost world of decay, a planet dominated by fungi feasting on the near-endless rot. Our own proud lineage, the synapsids, was shattered. The great predators and herbivores that had ruled for 50 million years were gone. The Great Dying was the closest life on Earth has ever come to being completely erased.
But in the ruin of this global catastrophe, a few hardy survivors, both synapsid and sauropsid, clung to a desperate existence. Life had been pushed to the very edge of oblivion, but it had not let go. The question now was, in this sterilized, empty world, who would be the first to rise from the ashes?
The great dying had scoured the world, leaving behind a planet that was a ghost of its former self. The early Triassic period dawned on a desolate, broken landscape. The intricate Permian forests were gone, replaced by sparse plains of hardy, scrub-like ferns. Pangaea was a vast, arid hothouse, a world of searing heat, low oxygen air, and punishingly dry seasons. In this hostile environment, the few hardy survivors of the apocalypse began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. The complex ecosystems of the past were gone. This was a world of disaster specialists, and for a time, it seemed our own synapsid lineage might reclaim its throne. The most common large animal on Earth in the immediate aftermath was Lystrosaurus, a tusked, pig-sized herbivore and a member of our synapsid family. Its success likely came from its ability to burrow, allowing it to escape the worst of the heat, and its simple, resilient diet. For a few million years, this humble survivor was the face of the recovery, a sign that our lineage had weathered the storm. But the saurosids, the ancestors of reptiles and dinosaurs, had also survived, and the harsh realities of the Triassic world gave them a series of critical competitive advantages. The race to refill the empty planet was on, and our ancestors, for the first time, found themselves falling behind. A key advantage for the sauropsids was in the simple act of breathing. The low oxygen atmosphere of the Triassic was a major challenge for all animals. The archosaurs, the new ruling group of sauropsids, evolved a remarkably efficient respiratory system, similar to that of modern birds. With specialized air sacs, they created a one-way flow-through loop for air, meaning their lungs were constantly being supplied with fresh, oxygenated air. This was far superior to the simple in-and-out tidal breathing of the synapsids. In a world where every breath was a struggle, the archosaurs could run faster and fight harder. Another crucial advantage came from water conservation. The arid deserts of Pangaea made dehydration a constant threat. Sauropsids excrete their nitrogenous waste as a thick paste of uric acid, a process that loses very little water. Synapsids, then as now, rely on water-intensive urea, which must be flushed from the body as urine. In a dry world, our ancestors were constantly losing a vital resource that their competitors were carefully hoarding. Bolstered by these profound physiological advantages, the sauropsids diversified with astonishing speed. They produced the ancestors of crocodiles, the first pterosaurs that took to the skies, and, most fatefully, the first dinosaurs, nimble bipedal predators that were faster and more agile than any synapsid. The brief reign of Lystrosaurus came to an end, and our lineage was pushed to the margins. The great reversal was underway. The synapsids, once the global superpower, were being outcompeted and hunted into obscurity, but they did not vanish. Our direct ancestors, a group called the cynodonts, survived by adopting a new and radical strategy. They became small. They became secretive. They became nocturnal. To survive in the shadows of the emerging dinosaur dynasty, They began to perfect the traits needed for a life in the dark. They developed better insulation, the first true coats of fur. Their metabolisms ran at a higher, more constant rate, allowing them to be active in the cool of the night. True warm-bloodedness was emerging. Their senses of hearing and smell became incredibly acute, while their brains grew larger to process this new wealth of sensory information. Our ancestors had lost the world, but in their retreat into the darkness, they were quietly forging the very traits that would one day define what it means to be a mammal.
The end of the Triassic period was punctuated by yet another mass extinction, a lesser echo of the Great Dying, but one that was profoundly consequential. It was a selective event, and it preferentially wiped out the large archosaur rivals of the dinosaurs. This final cataclysm cleared the stage, cementing the great reversal of fortunes and ushering in the undisputed 150 million year reign of the dinosaurs. The Jurassic and Cretaceous periods that followed were their world in its entirety. It was a world of giants, a time when the sheer scale of life on land reached a crescendo that has never been equaled. Sauropods with necks like cranes browsed the tops of colossal conifer trees, while armored titans like Stegosaurus and Triceratops navigated the fern-choked lowlands. And ruling over it all were magnificent predators like Allosaurus and the legendary Tyrannosaurus rex. In this world, the daytime belonged to them. Their dominance was absolute. And for our ancestors, the small, tenacious cynodonts that had survived the Triassic, this new reality presented a stark choice: adapt or perish. They chose to adapt, and their strategy was to disappear. Our lineage, which had now evolved into the first true mammals, retreated completely into the shadows of this dinosaurian world. They became creatures of the night, a niche that the largely diurnal, cold-blooded dinosaurs could not easily exploit. This single, crucial decision, this 150 million year-long retreat into the darkness, is the crucible in which the modern mammalian blueprint was forged. Life in the dark demanded a new set of tools. Sight was no longer the primary sense. Instead, hearing and smell became paramount. The three tiny bones of the middle ear, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, which give us our own sensitive hearing, were elegantly repurposed from the jawbones of our cynodont ancestors. This gave early mammals the ability to hear the subtle rustle of an insect or the distant, heavy footfall of a predator in the pitch black. Their snouts elongated, and their brains developed massive olfactory bulbs, granting them a rich, detailed map of a world painted in scents. To survive the chill of the night without the sun's warmth, they perfected their internal furnaces, becoming truly warm-blooded, and cloaked themselves in the ultimate insulation, a dense coat of fur. This high-energy nocturnal lifestyle required a high-energy diet. With their sophisticated, specialized teeth, they could slice the exoskeletons of insects, crush seeds, or grind up tough plant matter, making the most of any food the night had to offer. And to process this wealth of new sensory information and navigate a complex life in the dark, their brains grew proportionally larger. Perhaps most importantly, they revolutionized reproduction. They developed live birth and lactation. Instead of leaving their young exposed and vulnerable in a nest of eggs, a mother could now nurture her offspring internally, and after birth, provide them with the perfect food source, milk. This ensured a far greater survival rate and fostered the first deep bonds between parent and child. For 150 million years, our ancestors waited. While the dinosaurs shook the earth,
Our lineage was quietly becoming smarter, more sensitive, and more caring, perfecting the skills that would be needed for a completely different kind of world. The long night was coming to an end, and a sudden, terrible dawn was about to break.
For 150 million years, the world had belonged to the dinosaurs. The rhythm of life, the shape of the ecosystems, the very air itself seemed to beat in time with their colossal hearts. At the close of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago, this dynasty was at its absolute zenith. Herds of triceratops moved like living fortresses through forests of newly evolved flowering plants, while the skies were navigated by the magnificent pterosaurs. And observing it all was the apex predator, Tyrannosaurus rex, a creature of such power and scale, it represented a true pinnacle of terrestrial evolution. The world was a stable, intricate, and deeply established kingdom of giants. And in the undergrowth of this kingdom, our ancestors, the small, nocturnal mammals, continued their quiet existence, scurrying through a world that was not their own, living by the light of the moon. But in the deep, cold darkness of space, an indifferent messenger was approaching, an object that would bring an end to this age in a single, catastrophic day. It was a mountain of rock and ice, 10 kilometers in diameter, hurtling through the solar system at a speed of 70,000 kilometers per hour. To the creatures of the late Cretaceous, it would first appear as a new star, one that grew ominously brighter with each passing night. Then, on the final day, it entered the atmosphere, blazing a hole through the sky, a searing, temporary sun. It struck a shallow tropical sea in the place we now call the Yucatan Peninsula. The energy released in that moment is almost beyond human comprehension, equivalent to billions of the most powerful nuclear weapons ever built, detonating at once. The initial blast wave vaporized the asteroid and the ocean itself, creating a crater over 180 kilometers wide. It was a wound in the very crust of the Earth. The immediate effect was a planetary-scale firestorm. Trillions of tons of molten rock and superheated glass were blasted into suborbital space, and as this ejecta rained back down through the atmosphere across the entire globe, friction heated the air to the temperature of an oven. The sky itself would have glowed a terrifying incandescent red, igniting global wildfires and cooking any animal that was not sheltered underground or deep in the water. An immense tsunami, perhaps miles high, radiated from the impact site, scouring coastlines for thousands of miles. But the initial inferno was only the beginning. The colossal amount of dust, soot, and vaporized sulfur blasted into the stratosphere created a thick, impenetrable shroud that enveloped the planet, blocking out the sun. An impact winter began. Temperatures plummeted, and the world was plunged into a deep, freezing darkness that may have lasted for years. Without sunlight, the foundation of the global food chain collapsed. Photosynthesis ceased. Plants on land withered and died. The plankton that supported the ocean's ecosystems perished. The great herbivores with nothing to eat starved by the millions. The giant carnivores that hunted them soon followed. The dinosaurs, whose very size had been the key to their long and successful reign, were now uniquely vulnerable. There was simply nowhere for a T-Rex to hide. But for our ancestors, the very traits they had perfected during their long exile in the darkness became the ultimate survival kit. Their small size meant they needed very little food. Their burrowing habits allowed them to shelter from the initial heat and the subsequent cold. Their flexible, insect and seed-based diet meant they could scavenge a living from the world's wreckage, and their fur and warm-blooded metabolism allowed them to stay active in the freezing dark. The fire and the cold had acted as a great filter, and the meek, the small, and adaptable had passed through it. As the dust finally began to settle, our ancestors emerged from their burrows into a silent, gray, and empty world. The roar of the dinosaurs was gone. The long night was over. The small, furry creature that emerged from its burrow stepped into a world born of fire and remade by silence. The air, once filled with the deep resonance of sauropod footsteps and the calls of crested hadrosaurs, was now utterly still, save for the whisper of the wind through a graveyard of broken trees. The vibrant, complex forests of the late Cretaceous were gone, replaced by a monotonous global blanket of opportunistic ferns, a fern spike that marks the horizon of the apocalypse in the rock record. This was the Paleocene, the first epoch of a new era, and it began in the gray, muted twilight of a planet scrubbed clean. For our mammalian ancestors, this silent, empty world was not a tragedy. It was the single greatest opportunity in the history of our lineage. For 150 million years, the dinosaurs had imposed an evolutionary glass ceiling. Now that ceiling was shattered. The planet was a blank slate, an open invitation to grow, to explore, and to conquer. And conquer they did, with an explosive, chaotic burst of creativity. The most immediate and striking change was in size. With the predators that had kept them small and hidden now gone, mammals began to grow. Within just a few million years of the impact, a world that had known only shrew and badger-sized mammals now saw the evolution of creatures the size of pigs, then cows, and then bears. These were the first drafts of large mammals, archaic, experimental forms like Pantolambda, often with clumsy, stout bodies and brains that were still small relative to their newfound bulk. They were not the elegant deer or powerful tigers of today, but they were a bold declaration that the long age of hiding was over. The ecological vacuum was being filled. With new sizes came new diets. The simple insect and seed-based fare of the Mesozoic was no longer the only option. The first large, dedicated herbivores appeared, evolving grinding molars to cope with the tough vegetation of the recovering world. In turn, the first large mammalian carnivores evolved to hunt them. These were not the ancestors of modern cats and dogs, but fearsome, archaic predators called creodonts, with teeth specialized for shearing flesh. In the recovering forests, a new lineage took to the trees, their hands and feet adapting for grasping branches. These were the first primates, the very branch of the great mammalian tree that would, tens of millions of years in the future, lead to us. The extinction of the dinosaurs was the essential prerequisite for our own existence. Without their demise, our ancestors would have never been given the freedom to begin the long evolutionary journey towards intelligence. This initial radiation was a frantic and messy affair. Many of these early Paleocene mammals belonged to evolutionary lines that would eventually die out, replaced by the more sophisticated orders that were beginning to emerge alongside them. But this chaotic burst of experimentation was the critical first step in rebuilding the planet's biosphere. The world was no longer silent. The rustle in the undergrowth was no longer a tiny shrew, but a creature of substance. The age of giants was over, but the age of mammals had just begun, born from the ashes of a fallen kingdom.
The first act of this new era was complete, and the stage was now set for the rise of the more familiar dynasties that would shape the world we know. The chaotic, experimental energy of the Paleocene was the first act in the new age of mammals. It was a time of recovery and rough drafts, as life rushed to fill the void left by the dinosaurs. But as the planet moved into the next epoch, the Eocene, the world's climate began to change dramatically. A massive, geologically rapid release of carbon into the atmosphere, likely from undersea volcanic activity igniting methane deposits, triggered a super greenhouse event. This was the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a global hothouse period that would reshape the biosphere once again. For millions of years, the planet was a world without ice. Palm trees and crocodiles thrived in the Arctic Circle. The globe was wrapped in a continuous belt of warm, lush, tropical and subtropical forests that stretched from pole to pole. This great warming acted as a second filter, and the archaic, heavy-bodied mammals of the Paleocene faded away, outcompeted by more modern, agile, and intelligent lineages that were better suited to this new forested world. This was the true dawn of the modern orders. In the dense Eocene forests, the first odd-toed ungulates appeared, including Hyracotherium, the small, dog-sized creature once known as Eohippus that was the earliest ancestor of the horse. The first even-toed ungulates, the ancestors of deer, camels, and cattle, also emerged. Competing with the archaic creodonts were the first true carnivorans, the ancestors of cats and dogs. For our own lineage, this global forest was a paradise. The Eocene was the golden age of primates. With a continuous canopy stretching across the continents, they diversified and spread across the globe, a golden age of evolutionary opportunity for our arboreal ancestors. But the most remarkable story of the Eocene was not about the conquest of these new forests, but about an astonishing journey back to the world our ancestors had fought so hard to leave, the sea. The warm, shallow, and highly productive oceans of the Eocene were teeming with food, an irresistible lure. The journey began with a small, hoofed, deer-like land animal, perhaps like Indohyus, which likely waded into rivers and streams to forage or to hide from predators. Over millions of years, this lineage committed itself more and more to an aquatic existence. The fossil record of this transition is one of the most complete and beautiful examples of evolution ever discovered. First came creatures like Pachycetus, which looked like a wolf, but possessed the unique, dense inner ear bone that is the unmistakable signature of a whale. Next was Ambulocetus, the walking whale, a creature with short, powerful hind legs that could both walk clumsily on land and paddle powerfully in the water, much like a modern sea lion. Later forms like Rhodhocetus became even more streamlined, its nostrils having begun their long journey from the tip of the snout to the top of the head. Finally, by the late Eocene, the transition was nearly complete, with fully aquatic animals like Basilosaurus. This was a terrifying, serpentine predator, 20 meters long, the apex hunter of the Eocene seas. Its nostrils had become a true blowhole, and while it was a master of the ocean, it still carried the undeniable proof of its origins. Deep within its body were two small, perfectly formed, but utterly useless hind legs, a final, ghostly echo of a time when its ancestors had walked on land. This journey from land to sea was a powerful testament to the incredible plasticity of the mammalian body plan, a plan that had been forged in the darkness and was now, in the light of its own age, proving it could conquer any realm on Earth.
The Eocene epoch had been a long, planetary summer, a warm, wet, and stable hothouse that fostered the diversification of life in its vast global forests. But the Earth's continents, driven by the deep and patient engine of plate tectonics, were continuing their slow dance. As the Eocene drew to a close, South America and Australia finally pulled away from Antarctica. This monumental separation opened up the Drake Passage and the Tasmanian Gateway, allowing, for the first time, a powerful ocean current to encircle the southernmost continent completely. This Antarctic circumpolar current acted as a thermal barrier, isolating Antarctica from the warm waters of the subtropics. Cut off from the planet's warmth, the continent began to freeze. The formation of the Great Antarctic Ice Sheet had begun, and with it, the world's climate began a long, slow descent into a cooler, drier, and more seasonal reality. The age of the global hothouse was over. This great cooling fundamentally reshaped the world's ecosystems. The warm, lush forests that had dominated the planet for tens of millions of years began to retreat toward the equator, unable to cope with the cooler temperatures and seasonal droughts. In their place, a new and revolutionary biome began its inexorable march across the continents, the grassland. At a glance, grass seems simple, but it is a formidable and highly evolved plant. Unlike other plants that grow from their tips, grass grows from its base, allowing it to be continuously grazed down to a nub and still regrow. As a defense against being eaten, its blades are filled with tiny abrasive silica particles called phytoliths, microscopic shards of glass that make it a tough and punishing meal. For the leaf-browsing mammals of the Eocene, this new landscape was an immense challenge, but also a vast untapped resource. The age of grasslands would trigger a new evolutionary arms race, a contest of adaptation between the eaters and the eaten. To survive on a diet of this abrasive, low-nutrient food, the hoofed mammals, or ungulates, underwent a profound transformation. Their teeth evolved to become high-crowned, with complex ridges of enamel for grinding. These teeth grew continuously, erupting slowly from the jaw over a lifetime to counteract the intense wear from the silica in the grass. Their digestive systems became complex fermentation vats, housing symbiotic bacteria that could break down the tough cellulose. On the open plains, there was nowhere to hide, so speed became the new currency of survival. Legs grew longer and more slender. Feet that once had 5 toes were reduced to 3, and in the case of the horses, to a single, powerful hoof. Ligaments and tendons evolved to act like powerful springs, creating an energy-efficient, bounding gait built for endurance. This new generation of swift, hardy herbivores, in turn, drove the evolution of their predators. The old ambush tactics of the forest were useless on the open plains. The new carnivores, like the ancestors of dogs and bears, evolved into pursuit predators with long legs and incredible stamina, designed to run down their prey over great distances. The saber-toothed cats perfected a different strategy, using their immense power and fearsome canines to ambush and wrestle down the largest of the new grazers. As these new ecosystems of grass, grazers, and hunters spread across the world, particularly in Africa, the shrinking forests began to present a profound challenge to our own primate ancestors. The world of the trees was slowly vanishing, and a new world of grass was taking its place, an environment that would eventually force one lineage of apes out of the canopy and onto their own 2 feet. Beginning the final and most remarkable chapter in our long evolutionary story.
The great cooling that began in the Oligocene continued its patient work, and by the Miocene epoch, the world was a far cry from the global Eocene forest. In Africa, the cradle of our own lineage, this climatic shift was amplified by immense geological forces. The continent began to stretch and tear, creating the Great Rift Valley, a vast scar that threw up mountain ranges and volcanoes. These new mountains cast a long rain shadow to the east, further accelerating the retreat of the dense tropical forests. What was once a continuous canopy became a broken mosaic, patches of deep forest separated by wide expanses of open woodland, and increasingly by the vast golden seas of savanna grass. For the primates who had thrived for so long in the trees, this was a time of crisis and of opportunity. This was the ape's dilemma. The early Miocene had been a golden age for apes. They were far more diverse and widespread than the few species that survive today, with a multitude of forms, like Proconsul, an early ape that inhabited the African forests. These were highly successful, intelligent, and adaptable creatures that spread across the Old World. But as their world of trees began to shrink, this great ape dynasty was faced with a fundamental choice. One path was to retreat, to follow the dwindling forests into the humid heartlands of Central and West Africa, and to specialize even further in a life spent in the trees. This was a successful strategy, and it was the path taken by the ancestors of modern gorillas and chimpanzees. The other path was far more perilous and uncertain. It was the path of adaptation, to remain in the fragmented, dangerous, and increasingly open environments of Eastern Africa, and to find a new way to live. This was the path our ancestors took. Surviving in this new world of scattered resources and open spaces required a new way of moving. Knuckle walking, like a chimp or gorilla, is an effective way to move through a forest, but it is highly inefficient for traveling long distances across an open plain. The revolutionary solution that our ancestors stumbled upon was bipedalism. By standing up and walking on two legs, they gained a suite of profound new advantages. It allowed them to see over the tall savanna grass, to spot a distant predator or a promising source of food. It exposed less of their body to the direct, punishing rays of the equatorial sun. Most importantly, it was a far more energetic way to travel the long distances now required to get from one patch of woodland to another. And in a consequence that would change the destiny of the world, it freed the hands. Hands were no longer just for walking. They could now be used exclusively for carrying food, holding infants, and, in the distant future, for wielding the first tools. The fossil evidence for this first momentous step is subtle yet clear. It comes from a creature named Sahelanthropus chadensis, who lived nearly 7 million years ago. Its skull, discovered in the deserts of Chad, is in most ways very ape-like, with a small brain the size of a chimpanzee's. But the clue to its posture lies in the position of the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord connects. In four-legged animals, this hole is positioned at the back of the skull. In Sahelanthropus, it is positioned directly underneath, indicating that it held its head atop a vertical spine. This was a creature that walked upright. This was the very first of the hominins, the first member of the human family after the split from the chimpanzee lineage. The long journey of planetary change, from the great unconformity that enriched the seas to the great cooling that created the grasslands, had now focused its immense creative pressure on a single lineage of apes, forcing them to their feet and setting them on a new and extraordinary path. The first tentative, upright steps of our earliest ancestors, like Sahelanthropus, marked the dawn of a new lineage, the hominins. But it was in the Pliocene epoch, which followed, that this new way of life was truly tested and perfected. The African landscape was now a patchwork of open savanna and remnant woodlands, a far more dangerous and competitive environment than the forests our ancestors had left behind. This was a world populated by swift grazing herds, giant hyenas, and formidable saber-toothed cats. To survive here, our ancestors evolved into a remarkably successful and long-lived group of hominins known as the Australopithecines, the southern apes. For millions of years, they were the face of the human family, and our most intimate portrait of them comes from a single, partial skeleton discovered in the Ethiopian desert, a female, known to the world as Lucy. Lucy, a member of the species Australopithecus afarensis, who lived over 3 million years ago, is a perfect mosaic of our ancient past and our distant future. From the neck down, her skeleton is a testament to a life spent walking upright. Her pelvis was short and bowl-shaped like a human's, providing the stability needed to balance on 2 legs. Her thigh bones angled inwards, positioning her knees directly beneath her center of gravity for an efficient, stable stride. She was fully bipedal, a conclusion confirmed by one of the most magical discoveries in all of science, the Lioli footprints. Preserved in a layer of volcanic ash in Tanzania, these are the fossilized tracks of 2 or 3 of Lucy's kin who walked across a damp plain 3.6 million years ago. Their footprints show a modern arch and a forward-pointing big toe, the indisputable signature of a being fully committed to walking the land. From the neck up, however, Lucy was still profoundly ape-like. She possessed a small brain, only slightly larger than that of a modern chimpanzee, and a face with a forward-jutting jaw. Her large, thickly enameled molar teeth suggest a tough diet of plants, roots, seeds, and perhaps insects. The fare of a forager and scavenger, not a mighty hunter. She was a creature of 2 worlds. She walked the savanna by day, but her long arms and curved finger bones suggest she was still a powerful climber, likely retreating to the safety of the trees at night to escape predators. The Australopithecines were not yet human. They were bipedal apes, a highly successful hybrid that thrived for millions of years by combining a new way of moving with an ancient arboreal caution. Life for these hominins was a constant challenge. They had no sharp claws, no great speed, and their canine teeth were small and unthreatening. Survival depended on their wits, their social bonds, and their intimate knowledge of the landscape. They were a successful experiment, a long and stable chapter in our story, but the planetary forces that had pushed them from the trees were not finished. The global climate continued its slow, inexorable slide into the deep freeze of the Pleistocene ice ages. The African savannas became even more volatile and unpredictable. The bipedal ape solution had worked for millions of years, but it was now being pushed to its limit. For our lineage to survive the coming changes, a new and even more radical adaptation would be required. The next great leap in our evolution would not be in our feet, but in our minds.
The long and stable reign of the bipedal apes, the Australopithecines, was predicated on a world that was, while challenging, at least predictable. But as the Pliocene epoch gave way to the Pleistocene, The planetary cooling trend that had begun millions of years earlier accelerated dramatically. The great ice ages of the northern hemisphere began, and while Africa was never covered in glaciers, it was subjected to punishing cycles of climatic instability. The reliable seasons vanished, replaced by wild, unpredictable swings between wet and dry periods that could last for thousands of years. The familiar woodlands and savannas of the Australopithecines were in constant flux. For the hominins, this environmental chaos was a powerful evolutionary filter, and it forced another great split in our family tree. One lineage, the robust Australopithecines, or Paranthropus, doubled down on a specialized plant-based diet, evolving colossal molar teeth and immense jaw muscles to grind the toughest, most fibrous vegetation they could find. They were the ultimate grinders, but this specialization led them to an evolutionary dead end. Our lineage took a radically different path. Instead of evolving a more specialized body, we began to evolve a more flexible and ingenious mind. Faced with a world of scarce and unpredictable plant foods, our ancestors turned to a new, energy-dense, and highly reliable food source, the leftovers of the great savanna predators. This shift was marked by the appearance of a new kind of hominin, the first of our very own genus, Homo. This was Homo habilis, the handyman, and the most crucial difference was not in its feet, but in its skull. The brain of Homo habilis was significantly larger than Lucy's, a 50% increase that marks the beginning of a trend of explosive brain growth that would come to define our lineage. Its face was flatter, and its teeth smaller, signaling a departure from a diet of endless, tough grinding. The reason for this change was the invention of technology. Around 2.6 million years ago, our ancestors began to deliberately manufacture stone tools. This was not simply picking up a convenient rock, it was a conceptual leap of stunning significance. They would select a smooth, hard river cobble, and with another stone, strike it at a precise angle to fracture off a flake with a razor-sharp edge. This simple act, repeated across the ancient African landscape, represents the birth of culture. The Oldowan toolkit, as it is known, was a butcher's kit. The sharp flakes were used to slice through tough animal hides and cut meat from bone, while the heavy core, now a chopper, was used to smash open long bones to access the incredibly rich and nutritious marrow inside. These were not hunting weapons. Homo habilis was a clever scavenger. By observing the landscape and the behavior of predators like saber-toothed cats, they could move in after a kill was made, and with their simple tools, quickly access the high-energy calories that the great carnivores could not. This innovation kick-started one of the most powerful feedback loops in evolutionary history. Access to meat and marrow provided the essential fats and proteins needed to fuel a larger, more metabolically expensive brain. A larger brain, in turn, allowed for the creation of better tools, the development of more complex social strategies for locating carcasses and defending them from other scavengers, and a deeper understanding of the natural world. Culture was now actively shaping our biology. The challenges presented by the planet's changing climate had been met not with bigger teeth, but with a bigger brain, and the first spark of human ingenuity. Our ancestors were no longer just adapting to the world, they were beginning to think their way through it. The spark of ingenuity that gave Homo habilis its first simple stone tools had ignited a powerful new evolutionary fire. The feedback loop was in motion. Better tools led to a richer diet of meat and marrow, which fueled a larger brain, which in turn conceived of even better tools. Against the backdrop of the Pleistocene, with its dramatic and unpredictable climate swings, this cycle of biocultural evolution accelerated. Around 1.9 million years ago,
A new and revolutionary kind of hominin emerged from this crucible. This was Homo erectus, the upright man. And with its arrival, the story of our lineage changed forever. This was no longer a story of a bipedal ape cautiously navigating the African savanna. This was the story of a creature that was, for the first time, recognizably and startlingly human. The physical transformation was profound. While Homo habilis was still small and ape-like in its proportions, Homo erectus was tall, with long, slender legs and short arms, a body plan nearly identical to our own. The last vestiges of a life spent in the trees were gone. This was a body built for the open road, a tireless, long-distance strider, and the first great endurance runner in our family's history. Its brain had also taken another significant leap in size, approaching the lower range of modern humans. This larger brain was capable of a new level of abstract thought and planning, a fact made beautifully clear by the new technology it invented, the Acheulean hand axe. Unlike the simple Oldowan chopper, the hand axe was a symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tool, carefully flaked on both sides to produce a sharp, versatile edge. To create one requires a mental template, a preconceived idea of the final form, and the skill to impose that design upon the stone. It is not just a tool, it is an artifact of a thinking, planning mind. This new body and new mind allowed for a new way of life. With their ability to run for long distances under the hot sun, and with more effective tools for butchery, Homo erectus graduated from opportunistic scavenging to becoming a formidable hunter. But their greatest innovation, the one that truly set them apart, was the harnessing of fire. The deliberate control of fire was a Promethean leap. Cooking food unlocked vastly more nutrients and energy, further fueling the growth of their expensive brains. Fire provided warmth, allowing them to survive cold nights and push into cooler climates. It provided light, extending the day for social interaction and tool-making. And it provided a powerful defense against the great predators of the night. The campfire became the first truly controlled environment, a circle of light and safety in a dangerous world. Equipped with this powerful toolkit, a modern body, a sophisticated technology, and the control of fire, Homo erectus was no longer tethered to a single African environment. They were adaptable, resourceful problem solvers. And so, for the first time in the history of life, a hominin species walked out of its ancestral homeland. Following the great herds of game animals, they migrated out of Africa, spreading through the Middle East, across the vast continent of Asia, reaching as far as China and the islands of Indonesia, and pushing into the temperate climes of Europe. They were the first truly global human species, a testament to the power of culture to overcome environmental barriers. For over 1.5 million years, they thrived. But as their populations spread across the globe, separated by mountains, deserts, and seas, they began to drift apart, their long reign setting the stage for the evolution of new regional kinds of humans. The long and successful reign of Homo erectus, the first great wanderer, had populated the old world with a new and adaptable kind of being. But the very success of their migration contained the seeds of a new chapter in our story. For hundreds of thousands of years, the populations in Africa, Europe, and Asia were semi-isolated from one another, their destinies shaped by the unique environmental pressures of their adopted homelands. All the while, the planet's climate continued to fluctuate. As the great ice sheets of the Pleistocene advanced and retreated, creating and destroying land bridges and turning forests into tundras and back again. In this fragmented and ever-changing world, the human family tree began to branch. The Earth, for the first time, became home to a multitude of different, intelligent, and capable human species, all living at the same time. In the West, in the cold, harsh landscapes of Ice Age Europe and the Near East, the descendants of Homo erectus evolved into Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. They were the children of the ice, and their bodies were a masterclass in adaptation to the cold. They were shorter and far more robustly built than us, with a wide barrel-shaped chest and shorter limbs to conserve body heat. Their skulls were long and low, but housed a brain that was, on average, slightly larger than our own today. Their faces were dominated by a large brow ridge and a projecting nose, which likely served to warm and humidify the frigid, dry air they breathed. Far from the brutish cavemen of popular imagination, the Neanderthals were highly intelligent and resourceful. They developed a sophisticated new toolkit, the Mousterian industry, and were apex predators, capable of hunting the formidable megafauna of their world, from woolly mammoths to giant cave bears. They cared for their sick and elderly, controlled fire, and showed the first hints of symbolic thought. They were a successful and resilient kind of human, perfectly adapted to their world. In the East, across the vast and diverse continent of Asia, another branch of the family tree flourished, the enigmatic Denisovans. Our knowledge of them is a testament to the power of modern science, for they are a people known to us not from a rich fossil record, but primarily from the ancient DNA extracted from a single tiny finger bone and a few teeth found in a Siberian cave. This genetic evidence revealed a ghost lineage, a sister species to the Neanderthals that was genetically distinct and had been evolving in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. We know they interbred with our own ancestors, and their genetic legacy lives on today in the people of Melanesia and Australia. They were a vast and successful population, a different kind of human reality, but for now, their story remains shrouded in mystery. And back in Africa, the ancestral homeland, the lineage that had remained behind continued its own unique evolutionary journey. This was the crucible in which our own species, Homo sapiens, was forged. The intense climatic instability of Africa during the Pleistocene did not favor specialization for cold like the Neanderthals, but rather a radical new level of adaptation and behavioral flexibility. This African lineage began to develop the traits that would define us: a flatter face, a smaller brow, a prominent chin, and most importantly, a high, rounded, globular skull. This change in skull shape reflects a reorganization of the brain within, particularly in the regions associated with planning, social cooperation, and symbolic thought. For a time, the world was a human mosaic. It was a planet of multiple human possibilities, a world shared by our intelligent, successful, and long-lost cousins.
While the Neanderthals mastered the frozen landscapes of Europe and the Denisovans spread across the vastness of Asia, the story of our own species was reaching its climax in the ancestral homeland of Africa. For hundreds of thousands of years, hominins with skeletons just like our own had been living there. Fossils from places like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco show that as far back as 300,000 years ago, individuals with the high, rounded skull, flat face, and delicate chin of a Homo sapiens already existed. They were anatomically modern. Yet, for a long time, their behavior, as read through the stone tools they left behind, was largely indistinguishable from that of their cousins in Eurasia. The hardware, it seemed, was in place, but the revolutionary software that would truly define us had not yet been fully installed. The crucible for this final transformation was the relentless climatic instability of Africa. The advance and retreat of the great northern ice sheets created punishing cycles of drought and deluge on the African continent, a constant environmental churn that acted as a powerful evolutionary engine. This was a world that did not favor physical specialization, but rather cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, and above all, ingenuity. Sometime around 100,000 years ago, particularly in the coastal regions of what is now South Africa, something new began to flicker into existence. We see the evidence for it in places like Blombos Cave. It was not a change in bone, but a change in mind. This was the dawn of symbolic thought. The artifacts found buried in the sand of this ancient seaside cave are the first true stirrings of the human soul. Archaeologists have discovered small perforated seashell beads, clearly strung together and worn as personal ornaments, a sign of individual identity and social awareness. They found sophisticated bone tools, crafted with a new and delicate precision. Most remarkably, they found pieces of ochre, a reg mineral pigment, that had been intentionally and carefully engraved with geometric cross-hatched patterns. These were not tools, they were not doodles, they were abstract designs, symbols. This is the first known art in human history, the first time an idea was taken from inside a mind and given a permanent external form. This was a cognitive revolution. The ability to create and understand symbols is the foundation upon which all human culture is built. It is the bedrock of complex language, allowing us to speak of things that are not right in front of us, the past, the future, the imaginary. It is the basis for shared myths and tribal identities that can bind large groups of unrelated people together. This new cognitive toolkit allowed our African ancestors to organize themselves in larger, more complex social networks, to share knowledge more effectively, and to plan for the future with a depth that had never before been possible. The long journey of our evolution, which had begun with our ancestors rising to their feet, had now culminated in their minds rising to a new plane of existence. They were no longer just adapting to the world, but they were beginning to build a world of shared meaning within it. Our species was now complete, armed with a new and powerful kind of consciousness, and a small group of these behaviorally modern humans was now poised to leave Africa, not as simple migrants, but as the vanguard of a global conquest of imagination.
Armed with a mind that could think in symbols and a culture that fostered rapid innovation, our species, Homo sapiens, stood poised at the edge of the African continent. This was not the first time a hominin had looked out upon the world beyond. Over 1 million years earlier, Homo erectus had made a similar journey, spreading its kind across the vastness of Eurasia. But this new migration, which began in earnest around 70,000 years ago, would be fundamentally different. The first great wave had been a slow, generational spread of a new biological form. This second wave was a swift and decisive expansion, driven by the power of a new and revolutionary consciousness. Our ancestors were not just carrying better stone tools. They were carrying a world of shared ideas, myths, and plans inside their minds, and it was this that would allow them to conquer the planet. Their primary advantage was the power of their new, complex, and symbolic language. This cognitive toolkit allowed for a level of social cooperation and information transfer that had never before been possible. They could coordinate the actions of large groups of hunters with a new and deadly precision. They could share detailed, vital information about distant landscapes, the movement of migratory herds, or the properties of different plants. And they could build strong, shared identities, clans, tribes,
that bound them together and allowed them to maintain alliances over vast distances. This social and cultural cohesion made them incredibly resilient. Unlike their hominin cousins, whose technologies had remained largely static for hundreds of thousands of years, Homo sapiens were relentless innovators. They developed projectile weapons like the atlatl, a spear thrower that allowed them to hunt large, dangerous animals from a safe distance. They invented bone needles for sewing tailored clothing, essential for surviving colder climates. They created sophisticated fishing hooks and nets, unlocking the rich resources of the coasts and rivers. This new toolkit allowed them to spread across the globe with breathtaking speed. Following a coastal route out of Africa and across the Arabian Peninsula, they reached Australia by at least 50,000 years ago, a remarkable journey that required crossing open water. As they pushed north into the heart of Eurasia, they walked into a world that was already inhabited. For the first time in a million years, our direct ancestors came face to face with their long-lost cousins, the Neanderthals. This was not a simple violent conquest, but a long and complex period of coexistence, competition, and, as we now know from our own DNA, interbreeding. The proof of these ancient encounters is written in the genome of almost every non-African human alive today, who carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. For thousands of years, the two human species shared the landscape, but ultimately the Neanderthals faded away, their people and culture absorbed and replaced. The reasons for their disappearance are complex, but it seems that the cognitive advantages of Homo sapiens proved decisive. Our larger social networks, more advanced projectile technology, and perhaps a slightly higher birth rate gave us a competitive edge over the long run. The same story likely played out in Asia as our ancestors encountered and interbred with the Denisovans. By around 40,000 years ago, the other human species were gone. The great branching of the human family that began with the migration of Homo erectus had now, after 1 million years, been resolved. Our species, a tenacious lineage forged in the climatic crucible of Africa and armed with the fire of symbolic thought, was now the last human standing on Earth. By 40,000 years ago, the great family drama of the human species had been resolved. Our tenacious and adaptable ancestors, Homo sapiens, were the last humans left on a planet that they now shared with no other hominin cousins. They had spread from Africa through Asia and into the far corners of Australia and Europe, their success driven by a mind that could think in symbols and a culture that embraced innovation. But the planet was about to present them with their greatest challenge yet. The world was plunging into the coldest and most severe phase of the entire Pleistocene epoch, the last glacial maximum. This was the heart of the Ice Age, a time when colossal sheets of ice, kilometers thick, buried vast portions of North America and Eurasia, and the global climate was intensely cold, dry, and hostile. This was the world of the Mammoth Steppe, a cold, arid grassland that stretched from Spain to Siberia, inhabited by magnificent herds of woolly mammoth, steppe bison, woolly rhinos, and the formidable predators like cave lions that hunted them. For the human populations living on the frigid plains of Ice Age Europe and Siberia, survival depended on an unprecedented level of ingenuity. They became the ultimate masters of the cold. Using fine, delicate bone needles, a revolutionary piece of technology, they sewed together intricate, multi-layered clothing from animal hides and fur, creating the first tailored garments that could seal in body heat and keep out the lethal wind. Their hunting toolkit was sophisticated and deadly,
featuring spear throwers or atlals that allowed them to hurl projectiles with incredible force and accuracy from a safe distance. They built ingenious shelters, some, like those found in Ukraine, constructed from a framework of massive mammoth bones and covered in hides, a testament to their ability to create warmth and community in the harshest of environments. And in the depths of this freezing world, their symbolic minds flourished. In the deep, dark caves of places like Chauvet and Lascaux in France, they created some of the most breathtaking art the world has ever known. Magnificent galleries of painted mammoths, bison, and lions that flicker to light by torchlight. This was a people with a rich, complex spiritual and cultural world, a world of myth and meaning that sustained them through the long, dark winters. It was this incredible cultural adaptability that allowed them to push into the final frontiers. As the ice sheets locked up the world's water, sea levels dropped by over 100 meters, exposing a vast land bridge called Beringia that connected Siberia to Alaska. For thousands of years, people lived in this lost subcontinent, and from there they embarked on the final great migration, down the Pacific coast and through corridors in the melting ice to become the first people to enter the Americas. This final expansion marked a pivotal moment. Our species had now, through its culture, technology, and sheer resilience, become the first in the planet's history to inhabit every major terrestrial continent. From our origins as a small, vulnerable population of apes on the African savanna, we had walked to every corner of the globe, adapting not by changing our bodies, but by changing our minds and our tools. The conquest of the planet was complete, but the planet itself was about to change once more. The great ice sheets began to melt, the seas began to rise, and the cold, stable world of the Ice Age was coming to an end. This great thaw would present humanity with a new set of challenges, and it would lead to the most significant transformation in our entire history.
The conquest of the planet was complete, but the world our ancestors had mastered was a fleeting one. The Great Ice Age, which had shaped human destiny for over 2 million years, was coming to a dramatic and sudden end. As the Earth's orbit shifted in its long, slow cycle, the planet began to warm. The colossal ice sheets that had buried continents began to melt, and a great deluge was unleashed. For thousands of years, water poured back into the oceans, causing sea levels to rise by over 100 meters, inundating coastal plains, severing land bridges, and creating the coastlines we know today. The cold, dry mammoth steppe that had stretched across the northern world vanished, replaced by the inexorable advance of dense, temperate forests. The climate of our current epoch, the Holocene, had arrived, bringing with it a warm, wet, and relatively stable new reality. This great thaw triggered the last of the great extinctions. The magnificent megafauna, the Ice Age giants who were perfectly adapted to the cold, could not cope with the rapid warming and the disappearance of their grassland habitat. The woolly mammoths, the steppe bison, the saber-toothed cats, and the giant ground sloths all vanished from the earth. Their extinction was likely accelerated by the pressure of our own ancestors, the highly skilled and sophisticated hunters who had preyed upon them for millennia. With the disappearance of these great herds, the entire way of life that had sustained humanity through the Ice Age collapsed. The economic and cultural foundation of the mammoth hunters was gone. Humanity was faced with a profound crisis and a new choice. In this new, warmer and wetter world, people began to settle and focus on the smaller, more reliable resources around them. In a region of the Near East known as the Fertile Crescent,
Groups of hunter-gatherers began to intensively collect the seeds of the wild grasses, like wheat and barley, that grew in abundance on the hillsides. Over generations, a revolutionary new relationship with the natural world began to form. This was the dawn of agriculture. It was not a single brilliant invention, but a slow, gradual process of coevolution. People began to favor and replant the seeds from the most desirable plants, those with the largest grains, or those whose seeds clung to the stalk instead of scattering to the wind. This act of artificial selection, slowly, over thousands of years, transformed these wild grasses into the domesticated crops that now feed the world. At the same time, they began to manage and domesticate the local animals, like wild goats, sheep, and pigs, breeding them for docility and food. This transformation was the single most significant event in our species' history. Agriculture provided a storable, reliable food surplus for the first time, which allowed human populations to explode. No longer needing to follow the migratory herds, people began to settle down in one place, creating the first permanent villages, which would soon grow into the first towns and cities. The 2.5-million-year-old story of the nomadic hunter-gatherer was over. This new way of life came with new challenges, harder labor, social hierarchies, and the rise of new diseases. But it also unlocked a new and powerful trajectory for our species. The long, slow, deep time of biological evolution was now being eclipsed by the frenetic, accelerated pace of cultural and technological change. The foundations for the modern world, for civilization itself, had been laid.
The invention of agriculture was a complete rewriting of the human contract with the planet. For millions of years, our ancestors had been wanderers, living within the means of the natural world. Now, for the first time, they began to reshape the world to suit their own needs. This new power, rooted in a storable surplus of food, led to the final and most rapid transformation in our social history: the rise of civilization. The small, egalitarian villages of the first farmers began to grow. In the incredibly fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, the food surplus became so great that a new and radical idea became possible. Not everyone had to be a farmer. This surplus was the seed from which a new and complex world would sprout. This was the birth of specialized labor. As some individuals were freed from the daily toil of food production, they could devote their time to becoming potters, weavers, metal workers, priests, and soldiers. This diversification created a society that was far more productive and technologically dynamic, but also one that was fundamentally unequal. To manage the irrigation systems that fed the fields, to store and distribute the grain surplus, and to organize the labor of thousands of people, a new form of social organization was required: government. A ruling class of priests and kings emerged, and the simple kinship-based structure of the village was replaced by the rigid social pyramid of the city-state. These growing population centers evolved into the first true cities, like Uruk in Mesopotamia, bustling hubs of trade, religion, and power, protected by monumental walls and centered around towering temples. Managing the complex economy of a city like Uruk, with its thousands of citizens, its granaries, and its workshops, presented a new problem: memory. A single human mind could not possibly keep track of all the grain collected as taxes, the livestock owed to the temple, or the rations paid to laborers. The solution to this problem was another profound invention, one that marks the traditional boundary between the deep past and our own time. It was not invented for poetry or for storytelling, but for the practical, mundane purpose of accounting. This invention was writing.
On soft clay tablets, Sumerian scribes began to press pictographic symbols to keep track of their inventories. Over centuries, these pictures evolved into the abstract, wedge-shaped script we call cuneiform. This was a revolution in information technology. For the first time, knowledge could be stored and transmitted with perfect accuracy, independent of the fallible human mind. Laws could be codified, histories chronicled, and empires administered over vast distances. With the advent of writing, the long, silent era of prehistory came to a close. The human story was no longer written only in stone, bone, and genes. It was now being written by us. The pace of change, which had been measured in the geological slowness of ice ages and the patient rhythm of biological evolution, had accelerated to a blinding speed. The world of deep time, the immense and ancient story we have been tracing, had now given way to the noisy, turbulent, and ever-accelerating world of human history. With the invention of writing, we crossed a fundamental threshold, closing the final page on the immense, silent volumes of prehistory and opening the first chapter of our own recorded story. The narrative from this point forward is a familiar one, a story of civilizations and empires, of art and science, of triumphs and tragedies, all playing out on the world stage. For most of these historical millennia, we believed we knew our own origin story. Our beginnings were framed in myth and divine creation, placing us in a world that was young, purpose-built for us, and at the center of the universe. The mountains and seas were seen as a fixed and permanent stage. And our own history was believed to encompass the entirety of the world's meaningful existence. The deep, ancient, and ever-changing planet we have just spent our journey exploring was a complete and utter mystery, a book written in a language no one knew how to read. It was only in the last few seconds of our species' timeline, primarily in the 18th and 19th centuries, that we began to decipher this language and uncover the true, staggering depth of our planet's past. Geologists like James Hutton stood before rock formations, seeing layers tilted and broken, and realized that the slow, patient forces of erosion and uplift required a span of time that shattered all human conception. He saw in the rocks no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. And with those words, the concept of deep time was born. Naturalists like Charles Darwin, contemplating the immense diversity of life, realized that the slow, gradual process of evolution by natural selection required this very same gift of deep time. Eons upon eons for its creative work. The human-centric story began to dissolve, replaced by a new and humbling perspective. This new understanding cast a different light on the discoveries being made by explorers and scientists. When John Wesley Powell, the one-armed geologist who began our story, steered his boat into the depths of the Grand Canyon in 1869, he was not just an adventurer. He was one of the first humans to gaze upon the great unconformation with the intellectual tools to appreciate its terrifying and beautiful significance. He was seeing with the eyes of deep time, recognizing the missing billion-year chapter not as a simple geological curiosity, but as a profound statement about the age and dynamism of the Earth. This scientific unveiling was a second great migration for humanity, not across a physical landscape, but across a conceptual one. This journey into deep time has fundamentally changed our understanding of ourselves. to learn that our planet is 4.5 billion years old, that life has existed for nearly 4 billion of those years, and that our own species appeared only in the last few 100,000, is to be profoundly reoriented. We are not the central purpose of the universe. We are a late-coming and improbable twig on an immense and ancient tree of life. But this knowledge does not diminish us. It connects us. It reveals that the calcium in our bones was forged in the heart of an exploding star, that the basic blueprint of our bodies was laid down in the Cambrian seas, and that the very stability of the world that allowed our civilizations to flourish is a temporary gift of long-term planetary cycles. The story of the Earth is not a separate story from our own. It is our story. Our journey through deep time has shown us that the Earth is a place of immense and constant transformation. We have seen continents torn asunder, worlds frozen in ice, and life brought to the very brink of annihilation, only to rise again in new and wonderful forms. For nearly all of this 4.5 billion year history, our lineage was a passive participant, a product of these grand environmental and geological forces. But the agricultural and industrial revolutions fundamentally altered this relationship. The symbolic mind that was forged in the African crucible and the cooperative culture that allowed us to conquer the globe have now given us a new and terrifying power, the power to reshape the planet itself. We have entered a new, proposed geological epoch of our own making, the Anthropocene, the age of humans. From the perspective of deep time, the change has been shockingly abrupt. In the geological blink of an eye that is the last 2 centuries, humanity has become the single most powerful force of planetary change. Through our agriculture, our cities, and our industries, we now move more rock and soil each year than is transported by all the world's rivers combined. We have altered the course of the planet's great waterways and fundamentally changed the chemistry of its oceans. Most profoundly, by burning the fossil fuels that were laid down in the Carboniferous swamps hundreds of millions of years ago, we are reversing a planetary process, taking ancient buried sunlight and releasing its carbon back into the atmosphere at a rate that has few parallels in the geological record. We are conducting a global experiment with the planet's climate, the outcome of which is still uncertain. The echoes of our long journey through the past give us a unique and sobering context for this new reality. The story of the Great Unconformity taught us that catastrophic erosion can reshape continents and set the stage for new forms of life. We are now the agents of a new and rapid erosion. The story of the Great Dying, the Permian extinction, taught us that a massive release of volcanic carbon can trigger a runaway greenhouse effect and sterilize the oceans. We now watch as our own emissions rise. The story of our own civilization taught us that its very existence is a gift of the Holocene, an unusually long and stable warm period, a rare and precious interlude in the turbulent history of the planet's climate. But the story of deep time is not just a cautionary tale. It is also a story of breathtaking resilience. And we are the first species in Earth's long history to be aware of our own role in the planetary drama. The same consciousness that once painted mammoths on cave walls now builds the climate models that can predict the future. The same ingenuity that chipped the first stone tool now builds the satellites that can watch our planet breathe. We are the inheritors of an unbroken 4 billion year old chain of life, a lineage that has survived asteroid impacts, supervolcanoes, and planetary deep freezes. The question that now defines our era is whether this improbable thinking ape, whose origins lie in the deep and patient workings of the Earth, can learn to live in balance with the very planetary systems that gave it birth. Our long journey ends where it began, in the quiet contemplation of the Earth as a great library of stone. We began with a profound and unsettling mystery, a missing volume, a billion years of our planet's memory, torn from the rock record. We have traveled across the vast landscapes of deep time in search of an answer, and what we have found is a story far more intricate and beautiful than we could have imagined. The great unconfirmation, we now know, was not a simple erasure. It was a violent and creative act of planetary renewal. The grinding down of the supercontinent Rodinia was the catastrophic event that fertilized the oceans, oxygenated the atmosphere, and set the stage for the dawn of complex life. The missing billion years are not a void in the story. They are the invisible foundation upon which our entire world is built. The scar that runs through the planet's crust is the very reason we are here to wonder at it. Looking back from this vantage point, we can see our own improbable history not as a steady march of progress, but as a series of breathtaking survivals. We are the descendants of the humble chordates that hid from the armored giants of the Cambrian seas. We are the children of the tenacious synapsids that endured the great dying, the greatest catastrophe life has ever known. We are the inheritors of the tiny nocturnal mammals that waited patiently for 150 million years in the shadows of the dinosaurs, honing the very traits of warmth and care that define us. We are the beneficiaries of the adaptable apes who, when their world of trees vanished, found the courage to stand on their own 2 feet and walk into a new and dangerous world. Our story is not one of inherent dominance, but of incredible, persistent resilience. Here, on this Sunday morning in Taytai, as the world awakens, this immense story does not feel distant or abstract. It is intimately and profoundly present. The ground beneath your feet is a fragment of a tectonic plate, a piece of a puzzle that has been drifting and colliding for eons, a silent participant in the great continental dance. The oxygen that fills your lungs with each quiet breath was a gift, slowly and patiently placed into the atmosphere by countless generations of microscopic life. The calcium that gives strength to your bones and the iron that gives color to your blood are the elements that were scoured from the mountains of a lost continent and washed into the ancient seas. The very blueprint of your body, with its beating heart and forward-facing eyes, is a direct legacy of the great evolutionary arms race that exploded into existence in the aftermath of the Great Unconfirmation. To know this story is to understand that we are not merely living on the Earth. We are the Earth, made manifest and self-aware. We are its living memory, the consciousness that can look upon a simple line in a canyon wall and comprehend a missing billion years is a remarkable thing. It is the planet's own way of reading its autobiography. The story of deep time, with its immense and humbling scales, is not meant to make us feel small or insignificant. It is meant to make us feel connected. It is a story that reminds us that we are part of a single, unbroken 4-billion-year-old chain of resilience. We are temporary custodians of an ancient and beautiful inheritance. And in the quiet of this library, the long story continues, written in stone and in us.